Binge eating disorder is the newest addition to the eating disorder diagnostic category in the DSM. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we're exploring this condition, including its etiology, how it's diagnosed, prevalence rates, recent research, available treatments, and the potential of psychedelics to be helpful. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A couple of announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, you can check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. In this episode, Reid and I talk about a clinical trial that Numinus is running for binge eating disorder. If you've listened to the episodes that we've done in the past, you've likely heard us talk about some of the psychedelic clinical trials that we do. This trial is not a psychedelic clinical trial, but we do have several psychedelic clinical trials currently active at our sites in Utah. So if you're curious, you can go to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share the episode with somebody you think might want to hear it. Without further delay, here is our episode today about binge eating disorder. We're at it again. How you doing, Dr. Robison?
Very well. Thanks, Steve.
Good. I like your shirt.
Dr. Steve. Thanks.
Colorful.
Colorful indeed.
Right.
I like that. I don't know. Like, I figure if it gets a reaction from someone of like, oh, nice colorful shirt, that it did its job of doing something, whatever that something is.
Something positive.
Brightening the room.
People are definitely here to hear us compliment each other's attire. What we're getting into today. We thought we'd talk.
Your shirt.
This old thing? Oh, thanks.
It's blue. It brings out.
There's not a trace of blue in my eyes.
The gray.
The gray in my eyes. We thought we'd talk a little bit. We've talked about eating disorders in the podcast before. We have an episode probably over a year ago where we talked about eating disorders more generally. But we thought we'd pick one today, do a little deep dive, and maybe even talk about some of the cutting edge psychedelic research. Not a ton on this particular eating disorder, but thought we'd talk a bit about binge eating disorder.
Yeah,
so
let's do it.
Maybe you can tell us, Reid, what the heck is binge eating disorder and why is it different from some of the other eating disorders?
It's the newcomer on the block in terms of official diagnoses, the most recent and a distinct eating disorder added to the diagnostic book, binge eating disorder. And it's one where we just have right now one FDA-approved med. We'll get into all that,
Mm-hmm.
But what I find really interesting about binge eating disorder is that it's trying to characterize some phenomenon, human behavior phenomenon, binging, a certain type of binging, when it occurs frequently enough. But it's something like many eating disorders, something that touches into everyone's relationship to food, or many people. Like, I think many people have experienced a binge, even if they don't have binge eating disorder. And binge eating disorder is the most common of the eating disorders.
Yeah, like almost all of the diagnoses that we've tackled on the show, you can think of them on a spectrum of otherwise normative human behavior. And whether or not they reach the level of a diagnosable mental health condition has a lot to do with whether or not that behavior leads to significant dysfunction in their life, in certain major areas of life. Whether that's work, whether that's interpersonal relationships, or it's causing some kind of physical or psychological harm. In spite of that harm, you continue to do it.
Yeah. And in this case, a binge is typically defined as like an uncontrollable episode of eating, where you eat a large amount of food in a short period of time. It doesn't need to be defined, but it's typically considered to be like under 2 hours.
Right.
Because we do, in our binge eating disorder study we're doing right now, for example, we do need to characterize distinct episodes because that's how it's rated in severity when diagnosing, and also how you know if a treatment is working. And we could talk about that. We should, in fact, because it's, of course, not all about the food. It's
Right.
not all about the number of episodes. Like, there are driving forces at play that we need to understand and work on, and also there are other implications, ripple effects in someone's life. But back to the diagnostic criteria, it's having these binge episodes with the sense of loss of control, but then there's guilt and shame and other negative consequences that follow, like discomfort, etc.
Right. Yeah. So distinguishing it from what might be described as overeating, eating more food than your body needs.
Yeah.
These are just discrete periods. There's, like you mentioned, there's a speed at which you're consuming the food. There's often a sensation of being uncomfortably full, but continuing to eat, even though body signals are telling you that, the body doesn't need more nutrients necessarily. Yeah. And then, as you mentioned, it's not when we're diagnosing something, it's not necessarily just the outcome of the behavior that's negative. It can be, like you said, what drives it. What are the psychological factors present?
Yeah.
Like anxiety or shame or embarrassment.
Because for many people, the binge eating serves to stuff or numb the unpleasant affective states, if you will, the negative emotions. And when the binge eating stops, so do you could say, the anesthetic qualities of the behaviors. And hence the cyclical nature of these things, or it can become a pattern that repeats itself. But yeah, it's interesting. Another thing you mentioned about it's not overeating, I think is important, because if you look at the population of America that is obese or meets criteria for obesity, maybe 20 to 40% of them would have binge eating disorder. Still a lot higher than the general population of, say, 1 to 4% having binge eating disorder. And less than half of people with binge eating disorder have obesity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? That if you just look at somebody, you might not guess if they didn't sort of fit that stereotype of somebody who's overweight or obese by those metrics, that they might have binge eating disorder.
Yeah.
I also, sometimes I like to think there's an easy comparison here with a disorder like binge eating disorder and addictions. Right? Especially when we're approaching the treatment of addictions, we're not asking necessarily, and you've likely heard this phrase uttered before, don't necessarily ask why the substance, ask why the pain.
Yeah.
Right. It's not necessarily about the chemical hook, although it can be, of a particular substance. It's often what is that experience soothing or anesthetizing in that person that drives them to continue using. And so you could make a similar argument here with what perpetuates or starts binge eating.
Yeah, and it might be fun to follow this thread a little bit, and maybe you can humor the thought exercise to peel away some layers, because I find it really interesting to look at, what's driving this, or what is underneath this cycle or this cascade. Is it anxiety? Is it uncertainty? Is it negative, difficult emotions? But so let's look at anxiety first of all. It's controlled by our primal survival brain, right? And but I think it's fundamentally different than fear. Fear, and this is semantics, but for a purpose, I think. Fear is evolutionarily wired to protect us. And would you agree with a working definition for now of anxiety? Or so anxiety being something different. It emerges from our survival brain, but it's when your fear is what protects you from the saber-toothed tiger, but anxiety is what keeps you up at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the saber-toothed tiger eating you over and over, for example.
Yeah. There's kind of a temporal distinction here, whereas fear is what is mobilized to protect you from the threat that is clear and present. Whereas anxiety is the cognitive process, or the result of the cognitive process of anticipating what might be scary.
Yeah, and because of that, because it's an offshoot of this primal brain, it helps explain perhaps why talking ourselves down or out of it doesn't really work. When fight or flight comes on, or in times of intense stress, we divert resources to the ones that are absolutely needed, away from our gut and digestion, for example, into the skeletal muscles so you can fight and run or whatever, and away from the logical, rational reasoning centers of the brain in a way, so that, it's certainly difficult, if not impossible, to talk yourself out of it. But then following this thread, like, if anxiety is a negative emotion, what behavior is the person engaging in when laying awake at night, staring at the ceiling? Just like anxiety in some or periods of stress might lead to binge drinking or whatever. Could worry be a habit loop, an addictive behavior? Can you be addicted to worry is, I guess, the question I want to pose to you.
I think so. I think, I forget who it is who wrote the book, The Worry Cure. But some of the early cognitive behaviorists like Burns and Beck, they talked about the difference between productive and unproductive worry, and that sometimes worry can be unproductive when it's self-perpetuating. It's self-perpetuating because it gives us the sense that we're doing something about this thing that we're anticipating that could be dangerous or scary. So if I continue thinking about it, I'm warding it off or I'm preparing myself. And so that is one thing, I think, that can keep the anxiety loop going. Yeah,
it's a good point. And I just want to point it out because as we tease this apart, I think it's helpful to break it up into bite-sized pieces or distinct chunks. Like, there's a hypothetical case, a dude with anxiety, let's say, who works a super stressful job, has not found healthy outlets for that stress, comes home, discovers whiskey, starts to have a couple glasses, and then a couple weeks later, it's a pint a day, and before long he's passed out because his anxiety led to this behavior of drinking or this negative affective state, let's say, negative emotion. Just like in someone else it might lead to binge eating, or in someone else it might lead to laying up all night worrying.
Right.
And it's not so simple to categorize worry that way, but I like what you said about the unproductive worry.
Right.
I think is how I'd categorize it. But
yeah, and usually those negative affective states like worry or anxiety, they drive us to reduce the negative affective state, right? I mean, maybe it goes without saying, but that's often what creates almost this Pavlovian conditioning result where I feel uncomfortable. I discover a thing that reduces that discomfort pretty quickly. It becomes dysfunctional when that thing has, very sharp double-edged sword. So your example of drinking.
Yep.
It perpetuates because it works, but it's dysfunctional because it has negative, quote unquote, side effects, I guess.
Yeah. And what is more of a commonly used, perhaps casual term, but I think is a useful one, behavior swapping can happen, right? What happens when this individual, the dude in the case, goes to rehab and kicks his drinking habit and sets up his environment so he's not going to have another drink, but he's still, let's say all his treatment focused on was that,
right,
and he's back into the same situation, same intense stress. What does he do with that next? And I bring it up just to point out that understanding the psychology of our maladaptive patterns, I think, is the key to breaking free from them in a lasting way, especially one that won't get interchanged so readily with whatever it is that could be more or less maladaptive, but you're still on this cycle, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we hit record, we were talking with our producer about this idea of the oral fixation. And your example of the person who maybe kicks the drinking habit, but might behavior swap it with something else. I've seen it happen a lot, actually, where people who, as you described, kick the drinking habit, they might move on to something like overeating. It's another way through the passageway of the mouth, the gustatory senses, to numb the pain.
Yeah. And that's a good way to put it. And there is this emotion regulation model of binge eating that I think is a pretty solid way of describing it. It's well published. A number of studies have described it and kind of backed it up. Perhaps not the whole picture, if anything ever is, but the idea that this negative emotion can trigger the binge eating. And improve the mood state temporarily, like we're talking about. And then what we're wired to do is move towards that more immediate relief. Unless we have this kind of awareness plus on board that lets us treat it differently, we're going to end up in some kind of cycle defaulting to that relief, understandably.
Right. Yeah. One of the important sort of diagnostic categories, I don't know if it's a category, but like the symptoms of conditions like binge eating disorder is what follows after a cycle, and what perpetuates the cycle is the cognitive recrimination, like the shame, the guilt that then leads to more distress, that then leads to what we're used to doing to reduce the distress, which might be the binge eating in this case. And so it becomes cyclical in that way.
Yeah. And this is just to pause for 1 sec. And this is an example of what we were talking about earlier of it's worth looking at your relationship with food, no matter who you are. And even if you don't think there's a struggle there, because it is, I think there's more than meets the eye, and it's such a part of how we're wired. Like evolution and the propagation of species was heavily reliant on dopamine to help us procure and consume food, and sex to help us propagate the species. That's why these things get especially tricky when we're talking about food. When you're a kid and you fall off your bike and the parent is like, "Oh, don't cry, here's an ice cream cone." Right. These things are laid down early, like food as a way of getting temporary relief from pain.
Yeah. We even in our sort of colloquial speech have phrases like comfort food. So when I say the word comfort food, a stalk of celery probably doesn't come to mind, right? It's a slice of pizza or a box of donuts or something like that. It's these high calorie, extremely palatable, low nutrient value foods.
I just can't help but reflect on celery as a comfort food for me. And after
I was projecting.
At first I thought you were right, but then I just looked inside and I said, wait a second. It is a comfort food. So coming home after school growing up, those ants on a log snack?
Oh yeah.
Celery stalk, peanut butter, raisins. So yeah, that's more of a nostalgic, kind of like the Ratatouille movie or something.
The addition of peanut butter and raisins, I think, would probably graduate it into this, the comfort food. Mine was a full glass of chocolate milk, and followed by an entire bowl of chocolate ice cream. That was sort of my come home from school decompress favorite food.
It's funny looking back at just food and culture over the ages from a lot of angles, but even just I'm chuckling inside as I think about growing up. We had hot dogs in the fridge with nitrites in it, of course, back then, because we didn't care about them and didn't know whatever. And I sometimes would just like eat one.
Yeah.
They're pre-cooked, right?
But this, I mean, as funny as this is, it's also relevant for the context in which binge eating occurs. Because you look at the prevalence rates, and there's sort of how binge eating disorder runs in families. Does it run in family because there's a gene that is encoded with, binge eating disorder? Is it because in certain families there's a culture around food, maybe shame around food, secrecy around food, or like you were saying, food is offered up as a way to comfort negative emotions?
Yeah. And it's that same age-old debate, nature versus nurture, that is the wrong question, because it's always nature
both.
Plus. And that's a great example of it. And in fact, binge eating disorder is a great example of both, because there is a genetic predisposition, and there are, of course, some serious some serious societal, cultural, and family unit forces at play. And I think the heritability lands somewhere in that 50% range, like a lot of those more common, complex mental health conditions do, which means, yes, there is some of the risk of it attributable to how you're wired or your genetics. And all of this is further complicated by about 50% of people with binge eating disorder also have a mood disorder or anxiety, right?
Yeah, as a non-physician, a non-medical professional who doesn't know as much about physiology as you do, I sometimes wonder about that genetic component. Are there people who are predisposed to just react with more pleasure when eating a food than others. Like you could also make that case with alcohol, right? Certain genes make a person more susceptible to really, really like the feeling of being intoxicated versus another. We know that about other chemical hooks, from other substances. For some people, opiates make them sick. For other people, it makes them euphoric.
Yeah, there was a really fun, I can't speak to it much here. I'll just call it a teaser for now, but I read this old book chapter from the psychedelic literature that was like really temperament typing people based on their addictive tendencies. Not even the psychedelic literature, but beyond, but from the early original Renaissance days. But I found it fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, so to sum it up, binge eating disorder it occurs in response to these intolerable like emotional experiences in the absence of another way of coping, or in the absence of awareness of what you're doing often too, because we all need to eat, right? And it represents like an effort by the individual usually to regulate emotion by numbing, avoiding, soothing, even though we're not aware of it. And that commonly occurs. It's something like there are changes in our pleasure centers and everything else going on when we eat, in the absence of any disorder, right?
Right. And is it also true that what separates binge eating disorder from some of the other eating disorders is, at least in this case, there's no compensatory behavior. So there's not overexercising or purging, or excessive use of diuretics or whatever. And then is it true that there also isn't necessarily a preoccupation with body image with binge eating disorder?
It's not
a diagnostic category.
Yeah, it's not a required component. And so if there is purging after binging, in general, like that would mean bulimia as a diagnosis. And purging does not, like you mentioned, doesn't have to be only self-induced vomiting. It can be, I've had clients with many different kinds of purging mechanisms, including overexercise, including misusing their insulin. That's a category of its own. You might call diabulimia, but including laxatives, diuretics, diet pills, etc. Sometimes combinations, right? But it usually does have body image implications, and most people have some body image distress, right? Like it's the world we live in, and tragically is sets us up for that. We're steeped in a culture that really really tries to tie, and I say try, not suggesting this is done on purpose by any like culture as a whole. Like I think so many of us can relate to the distress from it, but tries to tie our self-esteem to our weight. But the thing is, you don't need to even know your weight to survive, to thrive, to exist. And that becomes a really tricky thing for the people I work with of eating disorders of any kind, disordered eating behavior patterns as well. Whether you are underweight, overweight, or anything in between, that could be a triggering thing to step on a scale. And that's why there's this movement, I think, worth mentioning here called Health at Any Size, or HAES, that I think is a great way for clinicians and everyone else to try and reframe the way we think about weight. Like that's just a number on the scale, and BMI, there's sure, we use it, and weight matters for dosing meds and whatever, but I think we need to take a step back from our attachment to weight in general. Right?
Yeah, weight and some of those other metrics, like you say, like BMI. There was, I forget her name, but she was kind of the superstar for the American rugby team for the Olympics.
Yeah.
And she was just awesome. Had a really cool social media presence, and just an advocate for strength and athleticism as well as beauty. This was kind of like her message. And she had a little video about her BMI, right? This is a very strong, very athletic.
This is recent.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember seeing like a cover, like was she on a cover of a magazine or something?
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. But she points out, like, if you just looked at BMI, I would be considered obese. And if you look at her, she's, incredibly athletic.
Bingo.
Right?
Yeah.
And so she's kind of making the same case. Like, come on, let's stop obsessing over these metrics.
So one of the principles of HAES is weight inclusivity, like accepting, respecting diversity of body shapes and sizes, because we're in a culture where the beauty ideal, it used to be called the thin beauty ideal, but now I don't even know what to call it. It shifts, like the Kardashian beauty ideal, like to just try and describe something that people could kind of picture is unattainable for human beings without intervening, right?
Sometimes surgery, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and then you have respectful care, like ending weight stigma and bias and discrimination. And then, health enhancements, another principle, attending to the physical and the emotional needs and the spiritual needs of people. And then eating for well-being. This is, I think, a big one, because how many times in our culture are we tempted to say, okay, I just had a burger, I need to go to the gym. But if for years I've been trying to compassionately extinguish, even the tendency to start to think in that direction, and try and adopt fuel for movement instead, or fueling, eating for both fueling this wondrous people suit we're in, and the connection and enjoyment and everything else.
And for pleasure.
Yeah.
Eating for pleasure. And
then the last principle of HAES, just to finish it, is life-enhancing movement, rather than exercising for weight loss. So it really gets at that point. So that's the HAES principles, just to when we're talking about culture, because I think we're starting to make some progress in this as far as awareness. Like there's the body positivity movement and everything else. But of course we have a long way to go.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because it is part of that biopsychosocial spiritual approach that we're trying to take. It's not just, okay, this person has binge eating disorder. What are the treatments? What are the medicines? What are the therapies? A quote unquote treatment, if you zoom out, could also be, how do we influence the culture? How do we influence the sort of zeitgeist, or the social cultural milieu within which these disorders occur?
Yeah. And there's a book, an older book that speaks to this. I probably have it behind me, but if I point behind me, there's a screen and not my bookshelf.
Sealed by the screen.
My bookshelves had to be censored. Just kidding. It's called Body Wars, but anyway, I'll just leave it there. So there are some brilliant folks working on that macro level as well. In parallel, we've got to work on both for sure.
Yeah. So let's pivot to the treatments then. What are some of the gold standard treatments for binge eating disorder?
Well, what's interesting, I mentioned there's one FDA approved medication for binge eating disorder, Vyvanse. And I worked on this years ago, even beyond the clinical trial realm, like working with Shire on kind of understanding the condition a bit by querying big databases, because this was new territory, and this treatment, Vyvanse, is an ADHD medicine, right? It was approved first for ADHD. That's how people would know it. It's a stimulant, like a newer form of Adderall, if you will, a different chemical. But those medicines we know can help with impulsivity and ADHD, and they happen to reduce appetite in general. And so if you look at what it did in the studies compared to the gold standard, which is therapist-led CBT. So therapist-led CBT was 5 times more likely to help people abstain from binging, and Vyvanse 2.5 times more likely. An antidepressant maybe 1.5 times more likely, some benefit. There are different ways of reporting these kind of numbers, but binge episodes per week reduced, say they're starting at 6 or 7, like in our binge eating study right now, there's 6 per week. It's moderate to severe binge eating or more, and therapist-led CBT reduced it by 2 or 3 a week, and Vyvanse by 1.5 a week. When you're comparing the two, so
is there any data on combining the two?
No,
by
see,
advance in therapy?
unfortunately, I'll try and keep us out of that heated territory. But like as we see in the MAPS, Lycos, FDA drama, it gets really complicated when you combine therapies and medicines, and
Right.
understandably, and not saying it's good, but understandably, drug companies are focused on and have to isolate the drug effect first and foremost. And then you'd hope that, like, at least we collectively as a society, the NIMH, the NIH, would put all sorts of resources into more studies like STAR-D that we've talked about that shed light on depression in an unbiased way. Not perfect, but yeah, that doesn't really exist. But I think it's a safe assumption that both would be better. The question is, does someone need the medicine, and what are the trade-offs? What are the side effects, the risks of taking the medicine? But even though we talked about risks of therapy very recently, they're certainly on a different scale, especially when you're talking about CBT for binge eating disorder. But maybe you could talk about what that might look like, or how could someone use principles day to day?
Yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most well-researched forms of psychotherapy out there, has a lot of data. Some might say it's because it's a type of therapy that lends itself well to clinical research compared to some other type of therapies that are more difficult to operationalize. But the basic premise being that what makes us suffer are these negative core beliefs that we have, and they're often pretty irrational. So a belief that nobody loves me, for example. That's pretty rare that you find a human being who is unloved by anybody. So imagine you go into therapy and you're stuck in this pattern of binge eating to soothe your emotions that you're having a really hard time regulating, and you've got a lot of shame around your eating behavior. So a course of cognitive behavioral therapy might help you first generate some awareness around this pattern of negative thinking, or as a CBT therapy might call it, cognitive distortions. And so generating awareness and then helping you through compassionate inquiry and experiments, correcting those beliefs. So looking for evidence in support or against those beliefs and practicing alternatives. And then as you also practice different behaviors, like instead of going for the food, I'm going to try to go for, something else that isn't food that also helps me regulate, a breathing exercise, meditation, reaching out to somebody who I care about, going for a walk, something like that, that eventually over time you break the connection between the behavior and how it affects or soothes the emotion that's the product of the negative belief.
And so we were talking at first about, you've got to understand, have some kind of basic understanding of the psychology to really extinguish the maladaptive pattern. And do you think that's getting to it with CBT in general? Like you're going to those negative core beliefs. How much do you think we're getting to the source with this approach?
CBT office sometimes gets criticized for not being experiential enough or for not going to the source. The source maybe being like, trauma, or going to where these negative beliefs, these negative core beliefs originated, and addressing them at the source of origination psychologically. It's not it doesn't spend a lot of time, especially in comparison to other therapies, dealing with unconscious content. But most therapists who practice CBT probably don't practice it strictly by the book.
Yeah.
A lot of therapists are more eclectic, and they'll use CBT as sort of the wireframe for the way they approach psychotherapy, and then we'll weave in other things. Yeah. So maybe in its pure form, it doesn't quite get there.
Yeah. It's just an interesting question. And also because I think there's a risk of staying stuck for too long in chasing the answers to some really old wounds. And and I guess my point is that CBT is effective, not for everyone and not entirely, but it's the most effective psychotherapeutic modality and treatment approach in general. And there are lots of other ones that may be better for an individual with their unique genetic makeup. And but yeah, sometimes it is, I think, a damn good strategy, and if not, takes care of whatever was needed, takes care of enough to open the door that longer lifelong journey of working on oneself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I mean, as the data indicates, CBT can be really, really effective in creating awareness and giving people opportunities to create space between stimulus and response. So you have the thought occur, oh, I really need to eat right now because I can't tolerate what I'm feeling. You incorporate a little mindfulness, create a pause. Well, okay, I'm having this thought that I really need to eat, but do I really need to eat? I'm having this thought that I can't tolerate this emotion, but is that true? I am not my thoughts. If I am not my thoughts, what could I do instead? So I have had clients, though, come to me who have had a course of CBT, and they can say, especially if they're mind-focused individuals who are particularly bright and self-aware, yeah, I know that this is a cognitive distortion. I know that I could probably tolerate this if I did something else, but there's something in the way. I just feel helpless in the face of this pattern. I need a different approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And so other approaches, I mean, DBT for some
dialectical behavior
individuals,
therapy,
because
focusing on emotion tolerance, right?
Yeah.
Regulation skills.
Those emotional states as triggers and providing skills for self-soothing that are different. And this is another therapeutic modality that's built on a foundation of mindfulness, or has that as a core component, right? And family therapy, sometimes when those family dynamics are really prominent triggers, interpersonal psychotherapy,
IPT,
there's some good data there. So there's even, I should rewind, CBT-E, like a specific form of CBT for eating disorders. Especially when you're learning this and getting the protocolized targeted version, because working with eating disorders does require added sensitivity to these triggers we're talking about.
Right.
And especially if a therapist is completely foreign to that field, and we're all steeped in this culture we've been talking about, right?
Yeah, just as an aside, because eating disorders can be particularly complex, if you're a practitioner listening to this, it's important that you practice within your scope of practice. So, if you don't have specialized training and you don't feel particularly confident, and you want to treat people with eating disorders, you might want to get supervision, consultation, or maybe refer people out until you get that specialized training.
Yeah. And even when you're seeking treatment for eating disorders, it's usually a team approach. There's usually a psychotherapist and a dietitian and a psychiatric prescriber and a primary care provider as well.
Yeah. It takes a village, and to that point, support groups can sometimes be really, really helpful. So binge eating disorder therapy in group format, it can help to reduce some of the shame associated when there's sort of this shared struggle and validation and encouragement and support in the group format. Yeah.
So, and that reminds me, just zooming out, like with binge eating disorder, what are the treatment goals really? And beyond just that one number that happens to be the best marker that the clinical world can find to define these things for research and insurance and diagnostic purposes of like episodes per week. But so you're of course wanting to interrupt the binge eating with the strategy, but you're working on establishing more of an adaptive relationship with food, a healthy, positive one, restructuring the maladaptive thought patterns that will have implications beyond just the food, right? And then your emotion, same with your emotion processing, emotion regulation. Like think of how many other areas besides the food get impacted by that in a positive way. And the coping strategies you learn, how can you use them elsewhere as well? So, I think it is a multifaceted approach, and there are even guided self-help programs with some success and some evidence to back it.
Right.
Robots in the future.
Yeah, AI therapists. We'll do an episode on that soon. But also self-concept, and you also mentioned that there's a lot of comorbidities with binge eating disorder. So if there's PTSD, if there's major depression, if there's generalized anxiety, if there's OCD, then your treatment goals would involve those things as well.
Yeah. So it hopefully goes without saying, but you really do have to step back and look at the whole person and in formulating a treatment plan. So yeah, anything else on mindfulness? Because I know that it shows up in these strategies, the effective psychotherapies as well. But it strikes me as perhaps one of the practically useful tools for our own, maybe even subclinical, subthreshold binge eating experiences, right?
Yeah, I mean, I remember doing a mindful eating exercise in graduate school to just kind of give us an example of how mindfulness could be used as a tool. Because as we described, binge eating mindfulness can be helpful in a lot of the stages there that starts with a feeling and ends with a binge. But yeah, just slowing the pace down and really paying attention to the sensation of eating, enjoying the food, the texture, the salivation, how it feels going down your throat, all those things. So sometimes, I mean, this would be part of a larger treatment plan, but sometimes, some exercises around mindful eating can be helpful.
Yeah. I remember being at an eating disorder conference once years ago, and this group from Harvard, I think, was presenting on the updated version of this mindful eating scale and approach, and there was this experiential thing that I thought was cool, because it was a chance to check in on a couple domains, like how hungry am I currently and how full am I currently. And you might say, measure that on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever. So try it right now if you'd like. But we don't have the meal in front of us. But then as you're consuming a meal, you could do that, take a moment during. And ideally, you're kind of attuned to this as you go. But you could take a moment during and be like, okay, well, before you even eat, it's like, where do I want to be? So I'm super hungry. And do I want to be in 10 out of 10 full? Probably not. Because that feels like
Be uncomfortable.
Yeah, stretched. So then you could check in on that during, ideally, and then after, to really, because we're made up of this prediction machinery, right? And I think one thing that mindfulness can do is help us like train these strategies that where they're more likely to occur or become accessible in the real world, and more likely to become their own patterns if we can really repeat them over time.
Right. So with the time we have left, do you want to talk about experimental or cutting edge treatments for binge eating disorder?
I think it's a good chance to plug our study that just kicked off in Draper. So for those listening in Utah, this is especially relevant because we're enrolling for a clinical trial for binge eating disorder. And outside of Utah, it's just an update of what's going on in the space. There are new medicines being explored. In fact, I worked with MAPS back in the day, several years ago, on their protocol for MDMA-assisted therapy for binge eating disorder and anorexia. We got that, worked with them to get it through the FDA, US FDA and Health Canada, at least approval to do the studies. And there's a study going on, TRIP, is it TRIP Therapeutics?
Yeah, TRIP standing for tryptamine, TRYP, TRIP Therapeutics. They're in phase 2A binge eating disorder, psilocybin-assisted therapy, and it's psilocin administered via IV, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And if you go to their website, they kind of give the rationale behind why they're doing IV as opposed to oral administration of psilocybin.
Yeah, it's intriguing, and I've been following their progress. There's been a little bit of preliminary data shared, and positive, encouraging, hopeful. But our study, back to that, is we're doing we're part of a multi-center trial looking at a medicine called solriamfetol, brand name Sunosi. We're looking at it for binge eating disorder. It's already on the market for narcolepsy because it's a dopamine and norepinephrine kind of medicine. So you can see how the mechanism is somewhat similar to what's the one med that's out there approved of Vyvanse, but different. It's not as controlled, and it's a different mechanism of action as Vyvanse, even though it's hitting some of that same pathway in a different way.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think about, like, what does that mean we're doing a study? It means that the drug company trying to bring this to market as an approved medicine has engaged a bunch of treatment centers across the country and probably in other countries, including ours, and they're paying for the treatment. So if people come in to our research clinic, even if they don't do the study, they get a free, very detailed evaluation, including blood work, EKG, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm a big fan of, like, if you've never volunteered for a research study, try it, even if you're not going to enroll in that study, because you're going to learn about yourself through the process. And not only is it no cost to the individual, they're often compensated. Nearly all the studies we do have compensation for time and travel for people. And, we can send an Airbnb if needed or whatever. And so if someone is a good fit, and there has to be the right severity in the absence of other conditions and on, the right mix, or usually an absence of certain other medicines. And if they're a good fit and they want to enroll, then typically these studies would be like a randomized controlled phase where you either get placebo or the drug. You don't know, we don't know. You might do that for 2-3 months. And then ideally, usually there's an open label where everyone gets a drug, you know it, we know it, and we can watch and see what happens and gather more data for this quest to get a new drug approved. So that's the big picture and plug for research.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit of a counterpoint to the enthusiasm. These are experimental drugs.
Oh yeah, don't do it. Just kidding.
Yeah. But of course, as you go through the screening process, there will be an informed consent process where, the potential risks will be explained to you, and you'll have an opportunity to decide whether or not that makes sense to do for you. And unlike a lot of other clinical trials, just to reiterate, this one is not a psychedelic.
Yeah. We do have a new psychedelic study, though, for postpartum depression that has kicked off in our Draper Research Clinic, Draper, Utah. It's close to Salt Lake City, for those of you who are like, what is Draper? And it's right across the street from across the parking lot from our clinic. And also under the Numinus umbrella, even though in the research clinic we've retained the original name of Cedar Clinical Research, because basically these are multi-year studies and a lot of regulatory powers that be are involved, and it's a little bit harder to change a name of something for certain things and contracts. But so it's cedarclinicalresearch.com if you want to check it out. But if you go to numinus.com, you can see, you just click on the study button and you'll go there.
Yeah. If any of you, fast forward through my intro for every episode, you don't know that I always plug the clinical trials. You can go to numinus.com/research. There's a list of some of our trials that we're doing and a way you can book a call to see which one that you might be interested in or qualify for.
I'm not going to skip your intro next time. I'm going to have a listen.
I work so hard on those intros.
And when you're out of town, I do them. Yeah.
So and you do a great job.
I've done a couple in the last year, perhaps. But so yeah, we're doing a clinical trial, and all the disclaimers are important here. But informed consent we take seriously, super duper seriously in research, as we should, and we should in the clinical realm. It's just much more formalized in research. Everything is. It's very clear what you're signing up for, when the visits are, and it's clear for you to decide to participate. Yes, no. Yeah.
Right on. Well, thanks, Dr. Reid, and your awesome shirt.
Oh, cool. Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Until next time. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.